We're now going to look at fixed joints, which are joints that connect two rigid bodies together. And the idea here is that they can act like a spring, so they can have an anchor point on each rigid body, and then you can determine how soft or stiff the spring is. So let's do something classic, which would be to make like a kind of bridge using these joints. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is go ahead and duplicate some of our objects. So I'm going to get some scene things set up really quick here. I'm going to change this platform and call it left platform. Then I'm going to duplicate it. We will call this middle platform. And we'll just grab it and we will move it over. And then I'm going to duplicate this. We'll call this right platform. Similar thing. We'll take it, we'll move it over. I'm going to back up a little bit. You notice these have an anchor point here. Well, what I want to do is take my anchor. Let's call this left anchor. And then we will duplicate this. We will call this right anchor. And since I like to have spaces, I'm going to put a little space in here. All right, so we have the beginning setup here. I'm going to take my right anchor, of course, and I'm going to move it over so that it sits over here. And then I'm going to look at my joints and how they're connected because, you know, the anchor for this joint is in the middle, and what I want to do is move it over to the left. And so there's a few things I want to switch. First of all, if you remember from our previous video, we set it up so that the rigid body wouldn't rotate around the z-axis. So we want to change that back to allow it to give it some rotation so our bridge can sag. And then I want to take my anchor and I want to connect it over to the left. And if you have auto configure anchor, you're not going to be able to move these around. But if you don't, then you should be able to take this and just drag it over here to the left. So this is basically attaching my anchor point to the left side of my object. And if I hit play now, you know, it's going to basically be hanging from that left side as it falls. So kind of like you would expect. So let's do the same thing over here for the right anchor. The right anchor is attached to the wrong object, first of all. So let's take the, I'm sorry, I said the right anchor, but I meant the right platform. So we're on the right platform here. And I'm going to take the right anchor and drag it over here. This will connect it to this object. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take my connection point and I'm going to move it over here. You can see now that my anchor point's on the right side. So now I should have these two connected here. Now what I want to do is add fixed joints to the middle platform. So I don't need a distance joint anymore. So I'll just remove it. And instead I will add a fixed joint. So I will add two. So here I have fixed joint 2D and I will attach the left platform to it. And then it already has, you know, auto configure connected anchor. I'm going to change that because what I really want, by default, it's going to put them in the middle, and I don't want them to be connected in the middle. I want my, you know, objects to connect here on the edges. And so I will do that by moving my anchor over here. And then my connected anchor, I'm going to take and I'm going to move over here. So now you can see a little green line between these two. And so this is going to connect it over here on the left. And then I'll do the same thing by adding another fixed joint. And again, I will turn off auto config. I will take the right platform, drag it over here, and then I'm going to take my object, my anchor, and move it here. And then I will move my other anchor to over here, so that it's connected over here on the right. Now, you know, you can move these around by simply grabbing them. So that's totally a fine thing to do. And by default, it's going to try to attach it to the edge. But, you know, you can also just use the X and the Y coordinates here, and then you'll have your joints set up. So at this point, we would consider these two fixed joints to be rigid. But let's take a look at what it looks like when we hit play so we can understand how they're going to work. And we'll see that there's some movement here. Now, it just occurred to me that we should probably make sure that we have turned off the constraints for the rotations, because when I copied this, these had these rotations. I turned it off on the left platform, but did not turn off on the other one. So now we can take a look at what the result's going to be. And what you see is that they'll sort of stick together because of the way the constraints are set. So let's go to the middle platform, and it's sometimes useful to run the game so you can simulate what's happening in the physics engine so that you can understand exactly how these values change it. Now the dampening ratio is, a value that's going to determine how quickly the spring returns back to its rigid form. So if you think of like stretching a spring or compressing it, it's going to determine how fast it moves back and forth. So sort of the stiffness. And the frequency is going to be the ratio, is not going to be the ratio, but it's going to be measured in hertz, and it's going to be the oscillation of that spring. And so if you increase these values, the dampening ratio to something like 0.1, and this will give it some dampening. But then we can turn the frequency up. So let's turn it up to about 3. And if we do that, you'll see that we get some give in our bridge, right? So I can bounce it and it starts giving you that sort of springy feel. It's definitely not a bridge I'd want to walk over. And then, if you change these to bigger values, you can see what happens. If it's bigger, the frequency becomes more stiff here. So, it's gonna support more, in some respects, different amount of weight, but then it'll be more springy as you walk across it or as something travels across it. So, play around with these to see what kind of values you like. I think that something like, 0.1, 0.1, and then if you turn the frequency down to 1 and 1, you have something that's really more like a rope that's gonna just sort of dangle between these values. And you can imagine having multiple, segments here so that you have a much longer rope, depending on what kind of behavior you're trying to connect. It all, of course, behaves funny because we have these fixed distances between here, but you could make this also a fixed joint between these things and give it some springiness, and then it would, also be more accurate in terms of, like, a rope or a cable or something like that for hanging, because those usually have some give to them. And so that's it with fixed joints. I mean, they're pretty straightforward. The other thing that you can happen is, of course, you can set the brake force or the brake torque. And if there's too much torque here, so if this thing were to rotate too much, it might break. And the same thing with the force. If you have too much stretch between these two objects, then it will break at a certain point. But other than that, it's very much like the other joint.